when we think of AI, we're encouraged by all the tech companies' marketing departments to see it as magic, to see it as just generating things out of nothing. And what we want to get across is that AI is not magic. AI is people, and it's feeding off of humanity.
Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're digging into an important but little advertised issue, the high human cost of low-paid labor required to fuel the AI machine. Silicon Valley has sold us the myth that AI is a frictionless technology, one that will bring wealth and prosperity to humanity. Sadly, the grim reality is quite the opposite. Hidden beneath the smooth veneer, a secret global workforce of millions labor in appalling conditions to make AI possible. It's the time-worn colonial model transported to a modern scenario. Cotton fields are now computer terminals, but the labor practices are still abusive. In order to process social media content and AI training data, it takes millions of hours of grueling labor. This work is outsourced to centers in the global south, where long hours, low pay, and prolonged exposure to disturbing materials like rapes and car accidents are the norm. But you won't see this on any ads for Meta or OpenAI. James Muldoon is a management professor at the University of Essex. He's based at Oxford University's Internet Institute, along with two other authors, Mark Graham and Callum Cant. The three men conducted hundreds of interviews over the past 10 years to investigate the labyrinth of workers concealed from view in several countries, but all linked to the power structure behind the operation. This research became the basis for his book, Feeding the Machine, which exposes some of the uglier underbellies of AI. Welcome, James, joining us from UK.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
So before we start, let me quote Brian Eno's glowing appraisal of this expose. I had no idea of the dark, tangled world of human exploitation and corporate greed that's fueling the growth of AI. Here we meet people working impossible hours for pitiful wages, just so we can get our orders a couple of hours earlier, while some billionaire gets richer. If you think, as I once did, the internet is some kind of free lunch, you need to read this book. So what did Brian Eno mean by this, James? Can you give us a kind of an overview?
Yes, perfect. So our book essentially is about the hidden human cost of AI. We want to get the message across that behind the smoke and mirrors, AI is people. So much of the work that powers AI is this work that's outsourced to what amounts to digital sweatshops in the global south. And it's work that's undertaken under really grueling conditions. So our book is really trying to expose the global supply chain of all the thousands of workers around the world that are working round the clock to make AI possible. And to just give you an example of this, one type of work that's really needed is something called data annotation. So we have this expectation when we see machine learning models that, oh, these are so smart, they're so clever, they must be able to do everything themselves. But actually, the exact opposite is true. In order to get these models to work, we require thousands of hours or thousands of pages of data. And this data actually has to be manually annotated. So let's take an example of like an automated vehicle, right? Like a self-driving car. In order for that algorithm to work, it has to view thousands of hours of street scenes. And you actually need human beings to go on those videos and to tag what's a tree, what's a person, what's a traffic light. All of that footage has to be manually tagged. In order to have 1 hour of tagged footage for an autonomous vehicle, it takes 800 human hours in order to produce that footage for that algorithm. So when we think about this, so, that just amounts to thousands and thousands of workers all across the world that are getting sent this work from some of the largest and most profitable tech companies in the global north, that are getting sent to what is called outsourcing centers in places like Kenya, India, the Philippines, places in Latin America as well. All of this work is getting sent out there, and it's often undertaken in truly appalling conditions.
So before we talk more, another example, probably the worst one in the book, was
Hmm.
this woman who is in Africa. I think she's in Uganda or Kenya, who
Which
has
one?
to
Which one are you
look at the
talking about?
appalling content. Is it Grace that starts the book, where she has to
Mercy starts the book. She's a
Mercy?
content moderator in
That's
in
it.
Nairobi. Did you
That's
want
the
me
one
to
I
say
found.
talk about her
Yes, please.
story?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, the story that we open the book with is truly remarkable, and it's one that really, I mean, it was the reason we wrote the book. When we heard this story, we thought this is something that everyone needs to know. And Mercy is a pseudonym, obviously, but it's a Kenyan worker that we interviewed in Nairobi. And she's a content moderator at one of these outsourcing centers, which means she gets to moderate all of the Facebook posts that are among the most toxic and disgusting on the internet, right? There's over 2.5 billion people on Facebook, right? So it is the entire humanity that's there. And one day, Mercy is moderating these posts, and she sees a horrific scene, a fatal car crash in her town of Nairobi. And she looks a bit close and she realizes that the victim in the front seat is actually her grandfather. So she learns of her own grandfather's death by moderating a toxic social media post. And so she gets up and starts screaming and runs out. And, what we found, really terrible about this story is not only that this is the kind of work that she does, and this is how she faces a news like that, but her manager, when she tells him what has happened, says, look, you're already in here today, so you may as well finish your shift and we might think about giving you a day off tomorrow. This is the kind of working conditions that she has. And so for the rest of the day, she's moderating post after post of the exact same incident from different angles, pictures, text descriptions. And that is her horrific encounter for the rest of the day.
So in that same instance, she talks about the fact that a lot of her work is watching violent, sexually explicit, and very disturbing content for 10-hour shifts.
Hmm.
And she has to take an action. She has to action one ticket every 55 seconds. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's right. So the one of the aspects of this work is, well, firstly, it's surveilled. So every aspect of your day is kind of monitored, and you've got screen monitoring software, and you also have to meet targets. So, this is Mercy's target is having to moderate one of these posts every 55 seconds. So, that's 60 an hour, that's several hundred a day. And this is kind of, the worst of the worst: suicides, rapes, child pornography, all of this stuff that gets put on these social media channels. You know, Mercy's job is to look at that and watch it closely, right? Because you have to tag it for the correct type of violation, right? And you have to tag it for the highest violation in Meta's kind of policy. So if it's just abuse, that would be one thing. If it's violence, it would be another. If it's some kind of horrific form of violence, that would be another type of post. And so they're forced to watch this kind of content very, very closely in order to detect the correct violation. And it's just again and again without any kind of sense of like proper psychological support or reduced working hours. The moderators that we actually interviewed said that at the outsourcing center they worked at in Kenya, they had what was called a wellness counselor. So they had one 15-minute slot per week where they could go and talk to a wellness counselor who had no psychological training. They weren't a psychologist, they weren't a therapist, they were just like a person, an obligatory kind of person that the company put in order to tick a box and say that they were getting some kind of counseling.
In addition to that, she gets $1.16 an hour, I think. And she also said there was constant demands for sexual favors within the management, which even if you reported it, nothing will be done about it. So it sounds like hell. The conditions for this sound to violate all sort of human rights. And in fact, today I think Kenya, there were workers in Kenya went on strike for having suffered suffering post-traumatic stress for doing this kind of work. Don't any international labor organizations monitor any of these workplaces? Are they all below the radar?
Yeah, so you're right to say that this work is incredibly dehumanizing, it's grueling. And we did see over the past couple of days that Kenyan workers who were working for one particular outsourcing company called Sama or Samasource actually have sued both Samasource and Meta for the PTSD that they experienced. So it's truly grueling work, kind of akin to digital sweatshops. Um, in terms of the kind of labor rights that are experienced by the workers on the ground, what they're asking for is greater dignity in their work, better pay and remuneration, and better working conditions. And they've actually formed their own organization. They've formed their own kind of labor union in order to fight for those. So they're on the ground struggling as best they can. I know we talk to some of those workers and we do kind of discuss those interviews in our book of the African Content Moderators Union. And they struggled. They struggled to gain alliances with traditional labor unions because a lot of them have very short-term contracts. Some of them are kind of temporary workers. It's very hard to unionize that part of the workforce. And they would like there to be more transnational solidarity of people around the world who can stand in solidarity with them. And we have seen a little bit of that. And we've seen some excellent research work and some excellent kind of solidarity work from researchers and NGOs and other tech workers in the global north who have been kind of running activities with them and running a campaign with them and supporting them. So that's been really good to see. But it's not enough because these tech companies are so powerful, and they're facilitated a race to the bottom on pay and conditions where if you try and make any noise in one part of the world, they're just going to try and shift the job somewhere else, right? So as soon as Nairobi becomes too difficult, they'll shift them over to India. So it's incredibly tricky game of whack-a-mole. And it requires transnational solidarity between different workers and organizations across the globe.
Which they don't have the infrastructure for.
Yeah, it's true. They're just not as well resourced as the big tech companies, right?
Well, it was said in your book that they have trouble even forming any kind of discussion about unions because they're under constant surveillance. And if you're a problem, there's someone to replace you. So you can't say anything.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is that the system at a lot of these centers, particularly the ones that we visited, was, everyone was on a 1 to 3 month contract. So you wouldn't even need to necessarily get fired. It would simply be a matter of the company not renewing your contract, right? And there were rumors amongst the workers that we interviewed that there were kind of moles or spies within the workforce. This is just what we were told by the workers, and that people who were talking about unions would basically be gone in a few months. So it's an incredibly difficult environment to organize in for any of these workers.
You refer in the book to extradition machine, you call this.
Oh, we called it an extraction machine, though.
Extraction,
Yeah,
that's right, that
yeah.
feeds off humanity's collective effort and intelligence, churning through ever larger databases to power algorithms. So what is the true nature of this extraction machine? What are the ramifications?
Yeah, so this is the one of the main points we wanted to get in the book. When we think of AI, we're encouraged by all the tech companies' marketing departments to see it as magic, to see it as just generating things out of nothing. And what we want to get across is that AI is not magic. AI is people, and it's feeding off of humanity to produce the kind of effects that it does, right? And that goes in multiple ways. First and foremost, it's feeding and extracting from our physical labor. All of these workers across the world that are required to annotate data sets, to clean them, to curate them, to work in data centers, to work as artists and writers, and all of the workers around the world that are powering this machine, that is a form of extraction, right? It requires our labor and it requires our work in order to kind of present itself as this super intelligent, superhuman, quasi-magical machine. We also think that it's an extraction machine because of the environmental cost, right? And I'm sure we can talk about that in a second. The electricity usage, the water usage to cool the servers is immense, and it's generating an enormous spike in the carbon emissions of the leading tech companies. Thirdly, and finally, we think that it's an extraction machine because of the way it feeds off our collective intelligence. All of the poems that were written, the paintings, the books, the novels, the New York Times articles, all of this intellectual work that exists in the data sets that it's built on. All the AI is doing is reformulating these and sending it back to us, right? So it's taking human data completely unacknowledged, usually unremunerated, although
Mm.
that is changing, and with little to no compensation for the artists, the writers, the painters that make all of this possible, right? So in every one of these aspects, what we see AI doing is extracting off of our work, our resources, our livelihoods, and creating, profits for tech companies.
So, you talked about the energy. I think a lot of people are unaware of the huge, you devote a whole chapter to this about how
Mm.
offshore in Iceland, they've got very good, pretty free power. So it's a great place to have a data center. And then you just, with these global fiber optic cables, you're able to transport this data, massive amounts of data in seconds around the world. So it's this very composite kind of structure where everybody has a little bit of information and a task, and it's as if nobody really knows the true nature of the big picture. And I don't want to sound sinister about this. It just is sinister because people are kept deliberately in the dark about the entire operation. And that goes for the water required to cool. And it's a statistic, an incredible statistic about the volume of water required in California to cool one center. And today in the news, they were talking about building new gas powered energy plants. And that's not going to fly in California to try and meet this great hunger that
Yeah.
for energy and water. So,
I think I think this story here is really important as well, and I can get into the kind of electricity and water usage, but let's go back to like 2018, 2019, where all the tech companies are starting for the first time, mind you, to put out environmental reports. And you'll probably remember at this time they all promised to go carbon neutral or carbon negative, right? They're like, oh, and Microsoft are like, oh, we're even going to take out emissions historically going back to the 1970s when the company was formed, right? What we saw as soon as AI hit the scene, huge spikes in their carbon emissions. One of them by 30%, one of them by 50% over 5 years. AI has dramatically increased the amount of electricity and water that data centers consume. So the AI industry alone, in a couple of years, will consume as much energy as a country, the size of the Netherlands, right? So today, when we think about data centers, they're making up about 2 to 3% of America's energy demand. And by the end of the decade, this is going to rise to 8%. So, a large data center is consuming as much energy as about a town of 50,000 people. At one of the data centers I visited in Iceland, where, a lot of, data centers are getting set up because it's a cool climate. It doesn't cost as much to cool the data centers down. I talked to the CEO and he said, look, before this, the server racks that we'd install there were fine for our purposes. But now we're getting AI workloads in. They're going to consume about 3 times as much electricity as the old workloads that we had in our data centers. So he personally could see this huge spike in consumption. He had to negotiate with the actual national authority about, can we pull more electricity from the grid? It's something that is going to enormously spike global electricity demand just at a time where we're not producing enough green energy to do that sustainably.
And back down to the water thing, it's going to come down to a choice of can we supply the natural population water need in this town versus meeting some Google or Facebook demand for their data center. And
Exactly. And all of this is so secretive as well, because and it's so hard to get exact statistics and figures on individual data centers. But there was this one time back in the early 2020, like maybe 2020, 2021, where Google actually made the headlines because due to a legal dispute, I think it was in Oregon City's water. It was found that Google was basically consuming as much as 30% of the entire
mm,
city just from one data center, right? And it's rare to see those kind of figures because it's all, nationwide or statewide, or they don't want to release figures or something like that. But when you see it in those terms, it's really striking. And you're like, oh, my Lord, like, these centers could be consuming as much as a whole town, right? And that we're starting to see more and more political conflict between local communities and data center providers because of this conflict over local water supplies.
well, things don't look good. Things don't look good, particularly if you think about the major players that are in with the incoming administration. This is the worrisome aspect of how do you control those things if all the major players have vested interests in making profits for their own private companies.
Mm.
It's very worrisome for the ordinary man on the street or woman on the street. Okay, someone's got a question here. As far as the human labor is concerned, it's a one-time effort to train the models. Companies, something a medical transcription that happens per case, but now a trained large language model for medical context eliminates continuous abuse. I'm not sure what the
Yeah.
question is there.
It's a really common misconception that human labor used to annotate the data sets is somehow in the past, or once it's done, it's over. It's just not how it works. And we learned this through interviewing, dozens of workers, of middle management, the CEO of some of these data annotation sites. You know, if it was just so easy as training the models and then you walk away and they're good to go, none of these companies would be in business, or in the next 10 to 20 years. And some of the tech executives are even talking about the models somehow training themselves, or annotating their own data sets. And what we found is that there are a couple of reasons why that's not the case. The first is the models continually need to be retrained, right? And new products need to constantly be developed. It's not good enough just to rely on something that was trained in 2020. There's all this new data you need to use. You need to make a more sophisticated model. You need to change it. They're constantly developing new products, new services, new applications. All of that constantly requires new data. It's an endless cycle. And it's also not something that only occurs at the start of the product development. It's a constantly iterative cycle where the data is being retrained and re-annotated. And humans are needed at the end of the process to verify outputs and to continually check that the models are operating effectively. So unfortunately, it's not something that is likely to disappear anytime soon. If anything, the growth for the sector, and you can look at the business reports and the statistics on this for yourselves, the growth is like 20% per year for the next decade, right? It's a booming sector that's only going to expand.
So in the book, we're introduced to an army of content moderators, data annotators, warehouse workers, all performing this fairly dangerous low-paid work. And you link it back to older established practices of gender, racial, and colonial exploitation. So this is an old model. Can you talk a little bit about the commonalities between that?
Yeah, so what we uncover in the book is really a kind of global supply chain, a global production network that makes AI possible. And what we seek to show in the book is that, look, this isn't the first time this has been done, right? The way that the AI systems are produced and the kind of global networks that make them possible follow very similar patterns. of global hierarchies between rich countries and poor countries, between former colonial powers and colonized powers. And that really what we're seeing is the kind of long-term effects of colonialism itself, and the kind of decades and centuries of underdevelopment that have made these kinds of relationships possible, right? So we do see a kind of neocolonialism in how an international division of digital labor is currently done, where the leading executives of these companies are in Silicon Valley, they're in America. All of the work is getting outsourced to Kenya, to India, to the Philippines. And you know, there's a reason it's going to former British colonies, right? Because there's a very poorly paid workforce. There are weak labor laws, and people speak very good English. And these are very, you know, opportune countries for American firms in particular, also European firms, to outsource back-end office work, which began in the 1990s, right? You know, there's many parallels between something like a call center, and a digital data annotation center. And we try to trace that relationship not only back to the call center, but back even further still to the kind of colonial period where you see the kind of, you know, global transportation and communication networks pile up on top of each other so that the same routes that the slave ships took during the kind of period of slavery, were the same ones where they run the copper cables, and they're the ones that they run the fiber optic cables because they were shown to be good routes to have kind of various forms of transport and communication. And the same, for example, on the eastern coast of Africa, the same port of Mombasa, where the British first built the Ugandan railway to extract resources and wealth from the country, is exactly the same point that the first fiber optic cable came in and was built in order to give digital jobs to Kenya. But in actuality, to start this very uneven and one-sided relationship where rich tech companies in the global north would outsource digital jobs to these countries, under very specific conditions of, you know, you do this low-paid work, and that's the extent of your participation in the global production of tech.
Also, the actual conditions themselves, you know, to have workers pitted against each other and competing to keep raising the targets that they have to
Mm.
do, perform. It's you're keeping them controlled and stressed, just like they're picking cotton to meet a certain quota, so that they don't have
Yes.
time to organize. They haven't got the energy to criticize the system because they're just surviving.
And that was like that kind of the daily stress and the daily anxiety was such a huge part of all of the conversations we had with workers in these centers. And what's more, you know, this is not only a stress in their individual lives, this is a whole global system that's designed to pit workers against each other from across the globe. One striking fact that I can tell you from the center that we visited was that they were made aware by Meta that, you know, they weren't the only center that was being sent this kind of work. They actually were ranked with five or six other centers that the same type of work was being sent to Nairobi, it was being sent to many other places across the globe, and they ranked them against each other, right? So if you weren't as efficient, as fast, as higher quality as the other centers, you wouldn't get the best contracts. You wouldn't get a little bump in your pay. So what we see is an explicit global race to the bottom on pay and conditions, trying to squeeze the absolute most out of these workers from the global south, that's being orchestrated by the leading tech companies. They're actually actively facilitating this, not simply, I don't know, trying to find someone to do their work at a good cost. They're trying to create a race in which, you know, all the workers are the ones that lose.
Somebody's written a question here. I've read that the giants are not even making money with all this. It costs them money for each request in ChatGPT. Are we getting used to a product that we can't afford economically, ecologically, or socially, and soon we won't be able to live without?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess it remains to be seen who will be the major winners of this AI race. You'll probably remember that for many, many years, Amazon was famously unprofitable. It wasn't until kind of very long into its development as a company that started to turn a profit. But we don't know if OpenAI and these other companies are going to be like Amazon and kind of become the most wealthy, powerful companies in the world. Or if it will be a kind of something that doesn't actually have a sufficient revenue stream. And certainly we can say that the jury is still out at the moment in 2024. I think I'm not quite as pessimistic as the questioner. I do think that at least the big players will probably make a lot of money. The one person or the one, sorry, group of people who are undoubtedly going to come out as winners are the ones building the chips. So the Nvidias and the TSMCs of the world, if it's a gold rush, what should you be doing? Selling shovels. And that's precisely what they've done. Who of the actual software developers will come out on top? It's too early to say, but I mean, I think the valuations are very big and perhaps a little overinflated, but I don't think all these companies are going to go bankrupt. I do think that there's something there and that enterprises are going to use it and they will find ways to kind of make it profitable for themselves.
Well, you bring me to a really important point in the book. Um, so this myth about AI improving quality of work,
Mm,
life for workers is of course untrue. The only people that seem to be having improved quality of life are the investors at this point. And I think the thing that was most startling to me was at the end of the book, you talk about the use of AI in Gaza by the Israel Defense Force. I don't think people realize this. I certainly didn't. You said, this is the quote, the first AI war, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, used kill lists generated by an AI targeting system known as Lavender to attack up to 37,000 targets with minimal human verification. So far from saving civilian lives, it's increased bloodshed. So it said the Israeli military accesses its AI and machine learning capabilities via Google and Amazon. But for the most part, workers don't know what's happening elsewhere in the network. The whole system remains opaque to all but a few coordinating actors. Now, this is pretty scary. Who are these few coordinating actors?
And just to note for your listeners that the kind of Lavender, the AI machine in Gaza, was original reporting from Plus 972 magazine. That was us kind of quoting them from the book. So definitely check out their article on that. But the leading kind of, the people that are kind of at the commanding heights of these networks are the major tech companies, right? They're the Metas, the Teslas, the large, Fortune 500 companies. They're the ones that have the power in these networks. And what we saw when we were kind of on the ground, at these outsourcing centers were that if Meta put a kind of stipulation in their contract, it would get done in a second. Meta says jump and they say how high. Like they are desperate for these contracts because it's some of the only, very profitable high-end work that's available to them. These are places where unemployment is really huge, where people are in the informal economy. The alternative for a lot of these workers would be doing things like selling juice on the streets or selling vegetables in the market or other forms of work in the informal sector. So it's not that they don't want the jobs, they want the jobs to be better. They want to be offered work that is dignified, that is respected, and that is paid appropriate to the value that they're producing for the company, which is immense. It's absolutely immense. The amount of profit and value these workers produce there, they are an essential part of digital technology and of AI, right? And they should have the kind of level of dignity and respect that they deserve because of the incredible work that they do. Um, but what we found is that the leading tech firms, they could make a difference, right? If they wanted to, they could clean up their supply chains. All they would need to do is put terms that, here's the minimum wage. People should get a living wage. They shouldn't be working more than 8 hours a day. They shouldn't have certain conditions. They should have proper psychological support. all of those things are well within the grasp and the power of the tech companies to do. The reason they don't, in fact, they do the opposite, they put them in competition with each other, is because it would cost them money. And it's just, I mean, to me, that is the most appalling thing about the whole situation, that, you know, you could be making billions and billions of dollars and you see your profits absolutely soaring, and you can't afford to pay someone more than a little more than $1 an hour. I mean, that's just, you know, that's just unjust. And I think that's
Remarkable.
kind of disgusting, to be
Remarkable.
honest.
Okay, well, there's a lot of stuff in the book. I advise you to read it. It's not
Oh,
easy
yes, I meant
reading.
to plug the book. Please buy the
Yes,
book.
it's important. Here it is, Feeding the Machine,
Oh, yes, that's the
Human
American
Labor
cover.
Powering AI. Okay, so let's bring the discussion a little closer to home now, because it isn't all happening over there. Some of the same operating practices are seen in the US Amazon warehouses. And today, in fact, US Amazon workers have gone onto their largest strike ever for better paying conditions. And we're going to see a little clip from a documentary now made by More Perfect Union.
I haven't been around for Thanksgiving or Christmas.
It's constant speed up for the holidays.
It's like twice as dangerous, I would say, because everyone's moving twice as fast and there's twice as much work.
Every horror story you read about Amazon is true, but worse. And that is why I voted yes for the strike.
So now we're going to bring in Josh Miller Lewis. Welcome, Josh. Josh is the co-founder and senior editorial director for More Perfect Union that made that documentary. And it's a non-profit advocacy journalism organization, which has recently been nominated for 2 news and documentary Emmy Awards and is one of the fastest growing new digital outlets in the last decade. So welcome to you, Josh. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary.
Maybe you could tell us why you thought it was important editorially to cover this labor dispute. And do you see any commonalities with Amazon's operating practices here and abroad?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me take a little bit of a step back and just tell you why we founded More Perfect Union, because I think it's closely connected to why we covered this. We founded More Perfect Union in part because I don't think that there's a lot of media in this country that is focused on the working class. My old boss, Bernie Sanders, when he became mayor of Burlington, Vermont in the 1980s, the New York Times ran a headline that said, Bernie Sanders plans mayoralty with a bias for the poor. And I like to think of More Perfect Union as an outlet that has a bias for the working class. And it comes back to this, there was, in the coverage of the Amazon strike today, CNN had a headline about how, don't worry, your packages won't be disrupted. And Fox Business, Sean O'Brien, the head of the Teamsters Union, was on Fox Business this afternoon, and they started off by questioning him, why would you strike at this moment? Why would you disrupt Christmas? And there's not a lot of coverage of labor in this country from the perspective of working class people. It's not that long ago, I think in the 1940s and 1930s, a lot of coverage, even in major newspapers and outlets, was from the perspective of working class people. If you had a transit strike in this country, it was covered as bus drivers, as a member of the working class. They were fighting for higher wages. Now you have a transit strike and it's covered as a disruption to people trying to get to work. And what our goal was with More Perfect Union, and continues to be, is to cover the issues that are important to working class people from the perspective of, we're all fighting for higher wages, we're fighting for better benefits. And so what's happening at Amazon right now matters to us as a working class that together is trying to fight to take on corporate power and improve our lives. And so I think that what's happening at this moment at Amazon is incredibly important. And it's the result of efforts over the last several years to build a labor movement at the company. It started in part in Bessemer, Alabama 4 years ago, where workers tried to organize, they failed. But part of what More Perfect Union was doing, and we were down there covering that very early on, was trying to sort of connect the stories of Amazon workers in Alabama to Amazon workers in New York City and California and Florida, and make sure that people know their struggle wasn't unique. It was shared, and there was something that people could do about it. You could organize, you could join a union. And so even though that effort failed, what we saw was workers in New York City at the warehouse of the video you just showed who actually did successfully unionize. And now 4 years later, you have one of the biggest strikes, or the biggest strike in the history of Amazon. And so it's building, and I think that the coverage of these moments is important to help continue to build that movement and create solidarity.
So let's go back to this. We do have a large working class in America, and you say 65% people, when they're asked if they're interested in joining a union, say they would, and yet only 10% belong to one. So what is stopping them here? What's the problem?
Well, I think there's a few things. One, labor law in this country is rigged against working people. Unfortunately, and Democrats tried to change this over the last 4 years. There was something called the PRO Act that failed. But you have labor law in this country that really makes it hard to unionize. You have to Employers are basically allowed to do anything they want in order to defeat a union drive. There's something called captive audience meetings, where employers will force workers into meetings where anti-union meetings, essentially. They'll drag out the election process. There's all these different tactics that employers use to fire workers. There's basically no penalties for violating the law. And trying to persuade people against joining a union. So I think that's a big part of it. There's a lot of fear that's involved. And we've seen this, again, going back to the original Amazon union drive in Alabama, Amazon will say to workers, well, if you unionize, we're going to close your factory tomorrow and we'll just move somewhere else. And that's a credible threat because this is a very powerful company. And a lot of these workers are being paid very low wages. Many of them in Alabama, for example, had just gotten out of prison. This was like one of the few jobs that they could have. And so if your employer is saying, well, we're going to close up shop and leave if you unionize, well, you're going to take the $15 an hour because it is a higher wage than anywhere else you can go. And so that, I think, is a big part of it. People have a lot of fear because, in part, the labor law in this country is rigged against them. I also think, though, that there's been a retreat on the part of unions and in a lot of places. And there's not as much money that's devoted to organizing as there used to be. And a lot of unions have focused, because of how hard it is to organize new workers, on maintaining their memberships, getting better benefits for people. And there hasn't been a lot of money devoted to new organizing. And that also is starting to change. You're seeing the Teamsters, United Auto Workers, other major unions that are devoting more resources to new organizing.
Can I just ask you a question? There's a new documentary called Union, which came out in London a few weeks ago, and it got great acclaim. It's gotten awards at the Sundance Film Festival, but I haven't seen it on general release here. And I'm wondering if this is part of the problem. Is there's this, as you said, this climate of fear that Amazon has tentacles in everything, and nobody wants to offend Amazon because it's connected with everything. So now this film probably won't get seen by people to really appreciate the scale of the problem. So I think workers are probably scared for their jobs, but they're also out of touch about the value of their own labor in a way they didn't used to be. They used to see that as a bargaining chip, and that collectively they had some power. That seems to have been diminished. So one quote that I thought was really interesting, it came out of the article today. Workers mention low wages, physical strain, but mostly they talk about the automation and how alienating it is. So this is hearkening back, James, I hope James comes back in there, because he has a chapter in the book about Amazon. So I think this is really not just the low wages, not just the physical fatigue. It's the fact that you don't mean anything. You don't have a value, you're replaceable, and you haven't even got time to have a conversation with the person next to you. So you can jump back in here, James, if you want, because you have a chapter in the book about Amazon. So would you say that their commonalities are, what I was saying here is that you degrade the workers' self-worth, their value, their belief in their own use, and you certainly diminish their autonomy because they're all under surveillance too. Amazon warehouses here, all the workers are on surveillance all the time. I can't take a break unless you get permission to take a break. Packages, are amassing around you, and then you met terrible accident rates. I mean, you know this, don't you, Josh? On the long weekends, on these prime weekends, Bernie actually raised this statistic. I think that accident rates doubled over the course of that weekend. So I think if people in the street understood that this was the price that ordinary people are paying to fulfill their silly orders, rush orders, they might think twice about putting something as a priority if it isn't a priority. So, James, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
No, I mean, I'm fully in agreement with everything Josh had said. It's part of a long history of de-skilling workers to the point where, Amazon employees in the UK who we talked to, saw themselves as just cogs in a machine, that all of the decisions, all of the power, all of the autonomy over their work was being taken away and actually controlled by logistics systems that were powered by AI. And, it wasn't just their working day, it was the entire operation of the company from the moment the customer clicks on packaging to, that going out in the trucks and the warehouses and fulfillment centers. And it was all kind of part of a big machine. And workers didn't really have much of a say over how any of that worked. And they worked under really grueling conditions.
So how do we change this public sensibility about all this? I mean, if it's hard for the word to get out in the news media, and they're not allowed to see films like Union, which were meant to go on general release but didn't, what's the answer to this?
I think part of it is starting to change. I mean, it's not quite at the level that we need to be, but since 2021, union petitions, places filing to unionize is doubled. So in 3 years, we had double the rate of new places that are trying to unionize. That's substantial, I think, and positive. I think you've seen, at Amazon, at Starbucks, at a number of very large corporations in America, workers starting to rise up, recognize their worth, as you were saying, and attempting to band together to bargain collectively. Even Donald Trump, I think, is starting to recognize some of the power of labor in this country, and we'll see how it plays out. And I'm not naive. I don't think it would be quite as strong as if we had another Biden administration or Harris administration, but he has appointed probably the most pro-labor Republican to his labor secretary of any Republican in recent memory. And I do think the Teamsters and others are starting to have more influence in the administration. And so I do think that there is some movement towards rebuilding the labor movement in this country. And it is coming from many, many more workers who are recognizing their worth and recognizing the power of joining a union.
So another part of the book, which we didn't really talk about, which is very important, is the areas of creative human expression, like art and music, that are being, including your voice, actually. There's an actor interviewed in the book whose voice has been stolen, whose livelihood was their voice. Without their permission or knowingly, they didn't know when they signed something, it was giving them lifetime use of their voice. So that's another whole area of dehumanization, that we're losing our voice, literally and metaphorically. So James, talk to that about where you think that's going in terms of protection against AI.
Well, to connect that to what Josh was talking about in terms of unionization, the threat that AI poses to the creative industries was one of the key points of the Hollywood writers' strikes that were happening. And there's a huge dispute in that sector. And one of the first kind of big union wins was actually including a bunch of clauses to prevent some of the big companies from abusing AI to basically make people work for less and trying to use AI to replace people in various roles. And one of the plans that was leaked for how they wanted AI to be used is instead of paying for extras to be in films, they basically wanted to do a full body clone of an extra, pay them for a day's work, and then just use them ad nauseum for the rest of the company's existence in whatever movies they wanted, right? They would, have these artificially generated people and like, here's your $150 or whatever it is they would get for that kind of work. And we literally own you for the rest of your lives, even after you're dead. And that's what happened to this voice actor that you were talking about. It's an Irish voice actor who signed a contract with one of the big tech companies during the pandemic. Didn't obviously read every single fine detail of the 50 or 100-page contract. One of the terms was, we will own your voice in perpetuity. So what did they do? They didn't just include her voice in their little product of announcing some kind of feature on Microsoft Word or whatever it was. They sold her the rights to her voice to a Chinese tech company, which then synthesized it, and now she competes against a digital clone of her own voice. So you can imagine the kind of jobs that are just completely hollowing out of the sector in all of these kind of creative arts jobs. And the problem is, like, these are the jobs that sustain the livelihoods of these people, right? Like, it's not just about getting the big, I'm gonna star as one of the leads in Pixar. It's like, no, I'm doing a dictionary. I'm doing like a workplace health and safety video. Like, all these little jobs is what sustains the career of an artist. And if they're the ones that go, the only people who are able to be artists are those independently wealthy Nepo babies, wealthy parents, and that's all we'll see in the performing arts, because no one else will be able to sustain a career in it, because all these kind of mundane, bread ticket kind of jobs are going to be gone. And I think, what we saw, very usefully illustrated was when Scarlett Johansson almost had her voice stolen, well, quasi stolen by OpenAI, and we had the announce of their new model, which would have a voice feature, and Sam Altman apparently is like obsessed with the sci-fi movie Her, in which Scarlett Johansson voices a kind of
Yeah.
robot who falls
Yeah.
in love with a human man, and he tweets her, at the product release. One of the voices sounds remarkably like her, but apparently is a different woman, and that has been confirmed. But obviously, it was made to like resemble her voice. Because she is wealthy and powerful, she fights back and they get rid of the product. But this is the point. Scarlett Johansson is wealthy and powerful. Most workers, most ordinary Americans, most other workers across the world, they don't have Scarlett Johansson-like powers. And that's why they should join a union, right? Because the Hollywood strikers won because there is power in numbers. And no one of them was Scarlett Johansson. Well, actually, they probably would have been, because they're all the Hollywood actors. So maybe there was a Scarlett Johansson there. But the point is this, we have collective power in a labor union. And the Hollywood kind of, labor strikes proved what can be won, and that can be won and is being won across different sectors. But it's about standing up to these companies who want to use AI as a tool to increase their profits at the expense of workers. And AI isn't the only kind of thing it's not the only tool in their arsenal. This has been a struggle for artists and for creatives for decades, right? This is what the big companies are trying to do. They try and get more for less, and to squeeze these artists so that they're the kind of last person that ever gets paid, right? So AI is just the next chapter in this, and something that, I would be very keen to see workers across all industries kind of unionizing and struggling against how AI is being used in this way.
We've got a lot of questions now coming in since we had that discussion. Other than refusing to buy products from Amazon or companies owned by Amazon, what can consumers do?
It's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer, but I do think it's fundamentally about supporting workers. There are groups like the Amazon Labor Union that are, seeking to raise money, especially in these early stages. Getting out to a picket line if you're in the area and joining, and I think just taking direction from them. There will be moments where they call for a boycott. They haven't currently. But in those moments where they're asking for support, doing what would be useful to the workers.
The common good is something that's coming up as a bell at the back of my head, but it's not ringing very loudly. It seems to have been muted in recent years, what the common good is. Okay, something interesting. This is from the book. We seem to have created a world. The humans are servants of the machine. AI is accelerating this. And you had a quote in the book, James, that I loved by Ernest Bloch, the philosopher. The most tragic form of loss isn't the loss of security. It's the loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different. I thought that
I
was
have that in
amazing.
every book that I write. I sneak
Brilliant
it in. I
quote.
sneak in two things. I sneak in that quote from Block and the names of my two mini Dachshunds, who I've had that in three books now, which is Karl Barks and Barkus Aurelius. So I
Good
write a
Lord.
character who has those dogs and that quote. And I think the reason why I love that quote is because one of the most tragic things about how technology has developed over the past 20 years is really this sense that like this is the only way it could be. Like to have the internet means we have targeted advertising, or to have machine learning means we have this incredibly extractive machine that is kind of stealing from us both
Mm,
physically and intellectually. And what I want to keep alive is the idea that there are possible alternatives to the way in which this technology is developed and deployed. And part of the problem is it's being developed by an incredibly small subset of the global population. The kind of pale male and stale like Californian guys, the PayPal mafia types, and we don't get enough buy-in and collective power in other parts of the world that due to kind of centuries of colonialism and capitalism don't have the resources or the networks or the standing to develop these kind of tools to the same extent and in the same way that is being done in places like California. And so, yeah, I think that uh, if you're interested in this kind of world, you need to start supporting alternative ways in which this technology can be used and alternative companies and not-for-profits and open source alternatives. And where you can make the exodus away from the big technology companies and use other ones. And I agree with everything Josh said about supporting workers and taking workers' lead on it. But it is in addition to resisting the power of tech, and I would say regulating tech, because I do think that there is work that can be done both in the EU and in the what's the American one, FTC. That's important as well. Bottom-up resistance is important. Top-down regulation is important. I think the third point of that is kind of reinventing and trying to support alternative forms for how technology can be used that looks to places in the global south and places outside of the kind of usual suspects, but also is trying to find more permanent ways to fund and institutionalize that. So drawing money and resources from different parts of the world in order to try and support this, because so much of the alternative kind of technology world is basically done by volunteers. It's done by people in their bedrooms, in their spare time, almost completely unfunded. And I think that's the big difference, that you get the big tech companies doing something and they literally pour billions of dollars into it. And that's what we don't see with some of the alternatives. And that's why a lot of them don't have the same user experience. The last time everyone tried to flee Twitter or X to Mastodon, and it's just like, what is this? Like Mastodon, it's just done in people's spare time. They don't have millions of dollars to do this. And so having financial support for those alternatives, and also, people who are in the know and who have skills, like donating those and kind of working on those projects is really important as well as the bottom up resistance and the top down regulation.
So I think, the myth of technology and this being sold to us, so it's being pushed upon us, was, all things are possible, as you said, the sleek, glossy model. And I wish that these awful jobs that the Amazon workers have to do on these conveyor belts, meeting quotas, and also that awful, awful dehumanizing job of looking at this appalling content that poor woman has to do. That should be done by a robot. That's the day I'm looking forward to. These are the awful jobs that should be replaced. And the interesting, satisfying, soulful jobs should be reserved for human beings. And they're the ones we're losing. They're the ones we're losing. So on that very uplifting note, I'm going to tell us that let's have a look at your quote again. The loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different. So I'm going to say, let's all imagine the difference. And it's up to us all to make that possible. So we have to keep this optimistic at this time. Right, I'm going to thank my two great guests for their gift of their time and knowledge today, James Muldoon and Josh Miller-Lewis. Thank you very much for making the time to explain all this to us. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Mary.